Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Art Basel Conversations. Lovely to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I'm astonished that you got up this early, given that many of you were probably still partying a few hours ago. But here we are. I want to thank Art Basel for continuing with this great tradition of hosting discussions around the fair. I think it's always important to take a step back and reflect a little bit on this art culture that we all live in before we all jump back into the commercial frenzy outside. And I especially want to thank our wonderful speakers this morning. We have a great panel, more on them in a minute, but let's just acknowledge them. Lars, Nittve, Roger Mandle, Juan, Ignacio, Vidarte. Please give them a hand for their thoughts in advance. Thank you. So our theme today is extraordinarily wide and extraordinarily deep. The subject of the panel is Inventing the Museum. It's a very modest title that we've come up with here. Let me explain for a second what we mean by that. In recent years, as many of you have been following this story, a great number of new museum projects have sprouted up in parts of the world that have seen very few museums in the past, in some cases no museums in the past. In Asia, in the Gulf, in other regions, in China alone, as we know, 1,000 museums are being planned for the next 10 years. So this is an extraordinary new chapter in the history of museums, but it's taking place in regions where not only museums, but visual art appreciation, in the sense that many of us have been accustomed to understand it, doesn't really look back on any particular kind of history. It looks back on a different history. So this is a very new environment, and this is what we're here to talk about today. You know, museums are themselves very new. I was reading the Herald Tribune this morning, which reports that there is now evidence of cave paintings going back far further than we ever thought, more than 10,000 years earlier. 43,000 years ago, people were making wonderful images already, not far from here, actually. And relative to that, museums are truly just a blip on the timeline. Museums are a few hundred years old. They really began proliferating in a major way in the late 19th century. And when they did, the parameters of museums, the way they look, what they do, were really set by Europe. In the 20th century, as the United States achieved greater economic and cultural dominance, American attitudes were sort of layered on top of the museums about education, about access, perhaps even about entertainment. A more democratic flavor was infused into museums through that American experience. So now we're in a new chapter in this history of the museum as these new regions, the Gulf, Asia, and elsewhere, are beginning to and are sort of poised to leave their own imprint on museums, on their contents, on their missions, on the way they're structured, on the way they're funded, on their functions, and on their design. So this is the invention that we're interested in, and of course this invention is really a reinvention. We may actually disagree whether we're even reinventing, but we'll see how the conversation goes. We have here three gentlemen who have each been involved in very, very significant new examples of museum projects which are literally being built from scratch. I mean, on empty land, but in places where this whole project of museum building is new. Needless to say, they have each had their own challenges. Each of these projects has seen its ups and downs, and we'd love to hear the war stories and anything that you can share with us. It's always good to get a sense of what you're dealing with. But I'd like to think that we're actually here to talk about something a little bit bigger than that. You know, each of you, and I know from conversations with you before this, have really had to grapple with taking your own established assumptions and personal histories of leading American and European museums and transplanting those assumptions, transplanting those practices into this new environment. And I think along the way, your perceptions, your conceptions of what a museum is or should or can be have been changed. And so I think our guiding questions today will be, how are these museums re-articulating our idea of what a museum is? What is it that we carry forward? What is it that we perhaps leave behind? What is it that we gain through these projects? Many of us have read Robert Venturi's famous book, Learning from Las Vegas. So today we're in a position to ask, what can we learn from Doha, from Hong Kong, from Abu Dhabi? So this is going to be, hopefully, sort of a pleasant conversation, and you're coming along for the ride. We'll see. And what I'll do is I'll ask each of our panelists to sort of share with us what has been sort of his most important sort of epiphany or change in his thinking through his experience. Then we'll sort of chat for a while, and then I think there'll be a little bit of time for everyone here, if you'd like, to ask a question. Not everyone, but those of you who would like to ask a question, to ask a question. On that note, I'd like to remind you, if you are asking a question, to please state your name and, if possible, your affiliation. The session is being recorded on video, as you can see, by the Absolute Art Bureau, which now is the presenting partner of Art Basel Conversations. So I think we'll start. And I think we'll start with you, Lars, because you have big news. Lars was in this room just the other day with a bombshell announcement that sort of really surprised everyone pleasantly. He is, as many of you know, is building an enormous new museum, which he will, I'm certain, correct me for saying museum, because it's actually a museum of visual cultures. It's not an art museum, called M+, which is in the new cultural district of Hong Kong, which is called the Kowloon Cultural District. It will open, I believe, in 1217-ish. Mm-hmm. On Wednesday, he announced that probably the world's most well-known collector of Chinese art, Uli Sig, former Swiss ambassador to China, donated 1,400 objects to the museum. This is a museum that doesn't yet exist as a building. This is a work valued at about $160 million. And in addition, you acquired 47 works for about $23 million. So now you have this foundational collection. A few words about Lars. God bless his soul, he started out as an art writer and a journalist. And then he went on to be chief curator at the Moderne Museum. He was the founding director of the Louisiana Museum. He started the Tate Modern, went back to the Moderne Museum, and is now in Hong Kong. So, Lars, what is this experience teaching you about what a museum can be?
Well, first of all, I think what it does, it really has enhanced my thinking about museums generally. Not sort of altered it so much, but just enhanced certain aspects that I think are generally important to take into account. The fact that the museum is not the same as the building, but actually that the building is a tool, and it's one of many tools that you have. That the museum is really, what we do there is we negotiate some sort of relationship between the artist, the art, the content, and the public. Mm-hmm. And I think that this awareness is sort of enhanced and strengthened, and that the building is, in a sense, less important than ever now, even though we definitely need a building and we're going to build a big building. And also that we have to, in a way, be prepared to be good dancers. I think what you have to build into the museum from the beginning is the ability to actually change your thinking, change your modes of operation along the way also. Even if you establish yourself as one thing, you have to be prepared to be something else. Mm-hmm. I mean, then you can say that, of course, we have to rethink we will have a different audience with different backgrounds, different histories. We will, of course, the concept of art is not as established, or the concept of design or architecture are not the same type of categories. They don't have the same role in this part of the world as they do in Europe or in America. And that, in a sense, also means that we have to rethink straightforward things as modes of presentation. How do we show things? I mean, a very clear example is, of course, in terms of art. In Hong Kong and in China, you have the Western concept of art, contemporary art as we call it, but you also have the long ink art tradition. And actually you look at ink art in a totally different way than you look at paintings on the walls. But that's not really taken into account in almost any museum so far that shows this kind of material. Right. They show them as paintings.
So for us, the idea of a museum is a lot of walls.
Yeah.
But for you, it's going to be walls, but also flat surfaces. So that's
yes,
going
I mean,
to be a very different.
When you look at a hand scroll, even if it's a contemporary artist that works with a hand scroll, it's a process of discovery. You unroll something, either on a flat surface, or you hang it up and you sort of roll it down. Usually, this is a very intimate process. It includes sort of handling something. Usually it's a group of people that sit down and you read the poem that's there also, and you engage in a totally different way. So I think that space has to be different, another type of intimacy. You have to think through ways of either making this a possibility that the public can engage physically, or find ways technically to simulate that experience. So
that seems to go completely counter to the kind of gigantism that we've been seeing in museums, and I might say also in art fairs. I mean, there's been a ballooning of space where objects are very lost. It seems like the kind of experience you're talking about would really be suited to a small room with chairs and tables.
No, I mean, we are in the final stages now of writing the brief for the architectural competition, which will be launched in the end of August. We'll start that process then. And of course, the challenge with a museum that is also about visual culture, which means art in all its different forms, including this form, but also design, architecture, moving image, cinema, and so. It's, you know, the great museums we know, the buildings we like, are usually sort of about one type of art. If you go to the Basel, which is a great building, I mean, it's about a particular type of art from a particular period, and it works for that. But here we have to create a building that actually works with very different types of material. And of course, also be aware of the fact that a lot of the things we'll be working will not even be interested in the building, so to say. We have to work outside the building in various ways. Digitally or physically in other parts of the city.
Right. So this is a whole new ball game. So Juan Ignacio, you are in an enviable position that you built a previous building, which how many people have been to the Guggenheim Bilbao? Good. You've got a lot of hopefully happy customers in the audience. So Juan Ignacio has been involved in the invention of 2 museums. He was has been Director General of Bilbao, which I think it's fair to say is a museum that in a way was the one that launched 1,000 ships and 1,000 other museum projects, and sort of Bilbao effect was the first one to really put it on the sort of consciousness of leaders and city leaders and country leaders that museums can really be a means of lifting a city or a country, which I think is very much a motivation behind some of the other projects represented today. You saw that project through its opening and running it today, and as if that wasn't enough, you took on another role in 2008 as the Chief Officer for Global Strategies at the Guggenheim, where you now have the challenge, let's say, of leading the enormous Frank Gehry project on Saadiyat Island. Many of you already know that Abu Dhabi, on this new peninsula off of Abu Dhabi, is building an extraordinary chain of cultural institutions, including an outpost of the Louvre, a couple of other things, including this enormous Frank Gehry Guggenheim, which is now, as I understand it, also slated to open in 2017. perhaps. So tell us a few words about what that experience has taught you.
Well, I think mainly it's a big opportunity to, I guess, to rethink what our mission is in terms of what a museum means. I think this is, to me, the great learning experience, which is still in process, of course. I think the fact of having to confront the project and understanding that many things that we are taking for granted about what a museum is, what are its goals, what are its audience, is really a very Western perspective that, as you were describing, it's even very limited in time, that we tend to assume it's been here forever, but it's really a very specific notion of what this cultural institution is. Having to confront a situation when there is no real, where museums are not really a part of the cultural background of those areas, means that we need to take on these projects with a fresh perspective. And I think this is a very interesting, learning, humbling, I think, experience, certainly for me. And connected with that, of course, it's the whole issue of how to approach and how to understand the audience of the museum, which is always, of course, for any museum professional, one of the main issues and the main priorities, but which in this case, of course, takes a new, it's a new challenge, because the audience, or probably better expressed, the audiences, the very diverse audiences that this museum, and I guess this is probably common to many of these new museums happening in many parts of the world, is first of all going to be very varied. There, the audience, the tourist audience, there is the very important expatriate, professional expatriates living in these places audience. There is the immigrant workers audience, the local audience. Each of those audiences have its own set of expectations. It comes from a different experience. For example, we are learning that for the local audience, and this of course makes it much more important, much more relevant, what the museum's role is in terms of an education institution, which I guess it's its primary role, but which in these cases, it's a role that becomes even more prominent. And for example, this learning experience of understanding how, for example, for this type of audience, for example, in the Middle East, the oral part of the story which is being told by a museum, it's really the most important, the most relevant, the best way to convey, probably better and in a more straightforward way than the written. Mm-hmm. So this has enormous implications in terms of how the museum presents itself and also how it conducts its education programs, for example.
In other words, say more about this. What do you mean by the oral part is more important than the written?
Well, because and we are still in the beginning of this learning experience, but we are clearly understanding that for example, the local audience, it's a much easier to engage with the presentation if the presentation is helped or conveyed through storytelling, through oral, through verbal explanations, more than if you rely on some written text or wall text or this type of tools. This is something that needs to be understood, needs to be digested, because we need to change the way we confront our role and our responsibility in terms of an education institution, because we need to adapt our tools to what the audience is more prepared, or it's more open to understand.
Mind you, at the Guggenheim, you already have, even in New York, an interesting program, the Guggenheim few years ago, trained their education staff in security so that people who are guards in the room are now actually education people and have been trained to engage the audience and begin conversations about the art. It seems like that experience will be very helpful to you in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, and it's an experience that we still have, and that we think it's a very interesting experience for our visitors, for some of our visitors. And certainly we can draw from that experience. But I think this is the beauty of these projects, that when you are asking us what are you getting, what are you learning from this experience, I think the beauty of the projects is that you learn in a way that transforms your own perspective, not just for that specific museum, but also hopefully it is a transformational experience for the whole institution, and that has effects in the other areas or venues or places where we conduct our activity.
Roger, you're in a enviable position among our three interlocutors in that you've actually finished some museums in Qatar. Roger spent 5 years, just returned to the United States after a 5-year appointment in Qatar, which I think it's safe to say that it's probably the most dynamic and in some ways culturally sensitive nation for cultural institution building in the region, which has really already created a number of them. And the number is astonishing. I believe that you were responsible for starting up 12 museums in Qatar and laying a roadmap for Qatar's museum initiatives. Of course, among those museums is the astonishing Ayampe Museum of Islamic Art, which is one of the world's great new museums, for those of you who have an opportunity to travel to the region. You're now senior advisor to the chair of the board of trustees of the Qatar Museum Authority. Before that, you ran the Rhode Island School of Design, and you were also chief curator and deputy director at the Washington National Gallery. So again, you're someone who took all that experience to the United States, and 5 years and 12 museums later, what have you learned?
Well, the number remains to be seen,
okay.
But it's an ambitious program nonetheless that's beginning to unfold with the National Museum of Qatar is now under construction. There are several others in the design, completing the design phases. The staffs are now being built. But maybe I could back up a little bit and just give a little bit of context about what Qatar is all about. Qatar is a very small country about the size of Switzerland or Connecticut, one of the cantons of Switzerland or Connecticut in the US. It has a population of 1.7 million people, of which 300,000 are Qataris. They now have achieved the status, somewhat awe-inspiring status for them and others, of being the most wealthy nation in terms of personal GDP in the world. They are just now beginning to realize the benefit of their natural gas resources, which are, by many accounts, they have the third highest natural gas resources in the world. So their presence is just beginning to be felt, and their capabilities have rocketed from being one of the poorest nations in the world financially on this small scrap of ground sticking into the Arabian Sea to being one of the most wealthy. From a Bedouin society about 75 years ago to one which is now fully connected with the rest of the world, their ambitions are now beginning to be articulated in ways that are very important to them, but I think to other people as well. They can be, I think, with all these resources, a kind of laboratory of all kinds of new ideas. And one of them, I think, is museums. In fact, we're beginning to talk about museums not as a place, not as a collection, but as ideas. What is a museum as an idea? Where, in the 21st century, do museums play a role, a relevant role in the development of culture? Now, most of us in this audience, in this hall, are really interested in art museums or in contemporary art, etc. But Qatar's agenda is very broad. It's to develop museums in all areas of human inquiry. And so we're beginning to think about them in a very different way. in my education in museums, my background started as a graduate student learning from German refugees whose whole thought about museums was from the object. And you start with an object, and you have more objects that begin to tell more stories about each other. There's a dialogue among objects. Mm-hmm. And then you create rooms around these objects that are places where this conversation can be, in a sense, bordered or transformed into a larger conversation. We're thinking about museums starting in the other way. We're starting from the outside in, as you were talking about the audience, and you were talking about the audience. We're starting to think about the audience first, particularly in a place where the audience is not familiar with not just museums, but all sorts of intellectual inquiry. We're now creating them as a kind of broad educational context for conversations among people, in which museums are places where curiosity is inspired and where people are challenged to think in new ways about not only the things they're encountering, but themselves as well. And since Qatar is involved with a very broad set of agenda items internationally, we're thinking about museums not as a place, but as parts of a conversation. And as museums begin to develop as institutions among people, then places become important, but so do interconnecting dialogues among people in other rooms around the world or through the internet. Or when you think about the different ways in which images of art can be encountered nowadays, the collections are only part of that reference point, because you can see them on the internet, you can see them on television, you can see them in hard publications and so on. So our span of interest is really very broad. It's not just within Qatar, but it's also outside. And we're thinking about the impact of the museums in Qatar, not from the point of view of a tourist coming to Qatar to learn about Qatar, although that's what the National Museum is about, to talk about all the historical and cultural elements of Qatar. But we're thinking about it primarily in terms of the service it can offer local people. And as the experience I had as director of the Toledo Museum in Ohio for a number of years, we felt that if our job of building a great program and collection in Toledo was important for them, it would be important to other people, and then other people would come. And I think that's pretty much the agenda that the people in Qatar have as well. That their first and most important agenda is to serve the people of that country.
Well, that's actually really a perfect segue to this question about collections I wanted us to dwell on a little bit, because you know, there's sort of two things going on. You're saying that we need to rethink museums as a kind of zone of discussion or interaction. Nevertheless, Qatar has been probably the single most active buyer on the market.
Well, but
one of the but then that I'm just saying that there's a lot of wonderful new works which are being purchased to establish these collections. Lars next to you just has 1,500 new objects. So where are we exactly on this question? I think it's a very interesting and provocative question. How much can we loosen up the idea of the museum as something without walls and perhaps even without objects? Or conversely, how much do we still need a kind of foundational collection to validate these institutions?
I don't mean to be light about the fact that Qatar is active and has been active. In fact, we had a collection of objects even before the first buildings were conceived, created by the royal family members, mainly for the purpose of turning them over to the nation. But they're playing a role, as so many other elements of this program are. We have a public art program in Qatar. We have an artist residency program. We have 2 major Kunsthalle that we've created, in which major exhibitions continue to roll forward. We have Damien Hirst, we've had Murakami, and so on. Places where we can bring art from other parts of the world, artists from other parts of the world, to create this kind of conversation that I'm talking about.
Lars?
But it's not really for us to say, I mean, if we should focus on objects or not, or whether we should collect objects or not, or we should, I mean, I think our role there is actually to follow the lead of those who develop the content, in a sense. If artists are doing objects that require walls and buildings and collections, fine, then we have to adhere to that. And if they're not, and if they work in totally different ways, or formulations take other shapes and forms, it's for us to follow that. And that's why I say that the building doesn't have to be the same thing. But the paradox is that we maybe, in a certain way, we're dismantling the traditional museum. But at the same time, I think that the symbolic value of the museum maybe is more important now than before. So what we always say that, I mean, in Hong Kong is that we're creating a museum that, on one hand, challenges the givens and the ideas of the museum, but at the same time, we want to create something that is clearly recognizable as a museum, because it carries important values.
So what are those values?
And a framework. Well, I think it's you can say that it's a safe space for debate and discussions and communication to start with. It's a place that is there to create this and optimize this sort of meeting between those who, artists and others who are producing and formulating things, and a public, and optimize for two parties. And that's two very different things. You have the public on one side, and you have the artist and the authors, so to say, on the other hand. And we have to optimize for both parties. And and create a safe space for them, in a sense, for this meeting. I think that's the critical thing. But that space doesn't have to be a physical space. It can be. It may be important. But the symbolic value that sort of indicates this is absolutely critical.
What do they symbolize for you?
Well, I think there are a number of contradictions in what we do as generally speaking in life. And I think certainly from the perspective of what I am more involved in, which is in the case of Abu Dhabi, for example, the model and the vision behind the drive to develop this important series of museums in one specific space of Abu Dhabi, of the city, certainly is connected with the power of the symbolic power of the notion of what a museum is, as we understand it right now. And because of that, I think there is certainly there is certainly a great power connected with the building itself. So it's not by chance that the three museums which are happening at this moment, or is being built at this moment in Abu Dhabi, are going to be housed in buildings which are going to have a very distinct architectural signature. So they are going to be very visible. Let's say they're going to be visual identity cards of what the ambition of Abu Dhabi means in the world of museums. The buildings are going to be significant. In our case, it's going to be a large museum, which doesn't mean that, and that's in part because the drive behind this effort, this ambition, it's the symbolic value of museums as they are perceived right now in the world, but also because right now the art which is being produced in the world in some cases requires large spaces and major spaces, which doesn't mean that their art now, and I think we all benefit from that, it's so diverse in terms of the production that museums need to be able to accommodate their spaces to be able to provide a welcoming space for artists to develop their wares. So just touching about the collection, I think because the notion behind these museums, it's in a way traditional because they are connected with the present notion of museums in the world. All these museums are going to have significant collections, and they're going to be which will need to be acquired, and which are being acquired. We're in the process of acquiring it, as the Louvre Abu Dhabi is, and as the Sheikh Zayed Museum will be.
There, if I may say that, relative to that, I think I had 3 or 4 different conversations in the last 2 days where somebody said around the table, there's so much replication of effort in acquisitions that many museums, not just these ones, but others, are buying very similar works, very similar artists, that there's a kind of blue chip sort of must-have group of artists. As these museums take root and more confidence, how can we avoid that kind of replication? Should we avoid? I mean, where do you see more distinctive and new types of collecting habits emerge in your different backyards?
Well, in our case, I think the paradigm for the museum is certainly to, as I guess in any other museum, is to be a distinctive institution, an institution that it's clearly defined by its own features, by its own characteristics, one of them being the collection. So the collection which is being acquired and which will be acquired will try to have significant works of the art of the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century. It will also have, or aspires to have, a major representation of art of the region. It's predicated on this notion of the transnational.
Lars is jumping.
Yeah, no, but I think this is a really important question. But to me, it's, I mean, almost. I shouldn't say all, but I mean, Barnes' collection is not so much about Philadelphia. But I mean, almost all great museums we know, and the ones that are, have stayed great for a long time, they're really anchored in their place. And you have no doubt of where you are when you go there. If you go to the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, in the Centre Pompidou, I mean, you never doubt that you're in Paris and that you're in France and that you're in Europe. And, of course, you're also in the world. Right. And I think, of course, this is, I mean, what we're trying to do is to use the same method, the same model. We just look at the world from a different vantage point. We look at it from Hong Kong, China.
But that's a little easier, perhaps, when you're in such a place like Hong Kong or China, where there's a thriving art market and the sort of Chinese art and so on.
And a long history of
visual production. More cultural homogeneity. What do you do in a country where the local population is 10% of the population? How do you build a museum where your attendees are going to be 60% tourists, 80% expats? How do you build that kind of a transnational museum? How do you then go about collecting?
Well, one of the things we've done in Qatar is to create a museum called the Museum of Arab, Modern, and Contemporary Art. And we have a collection of over 7,000 objects already that represent artists from the region. And we also are commissioning work. We're also creating artist residency programs to bring artists from the region together there. We work in collaboration with Virginia Commonwealth University, Qatar, which is a campus that has a fine arts graduate program, and other schools in the region. And so we're definitely aware of and think it's very important to inspire this. Again, it's bringing the level of conversation together in which artists from the region and artists from the rest of the world interact, influencing, speaking to each other in the way the 21st century can allow.
When people enter these museums, or as you anticipate them coming, they're going to be coming face to face with art objects. And we have a certain kind of, we have been acculturated into interacting with visual art in a certain way. These patterns were largely developed in the last couple of hundred years in the West, the sort of aesthetic contemplation of art as something you sort of look at, and then you have a kind of hopefully transforming experience, a kind of aesthetic encounter. I think it's fair to say that that's a rather different, so in some respects, different way of encountering visual objects as in your region. So, what is the? Are you anticipating dealing with that issue in some way? Can you teach people how to appreciate art in a Western way, or should it be an entirely new way of engineering the interaction between people and objects? How are you thinking about that?
Go ahead. You have more.
No. Well, one thing that's for certain is that you have to really listen well and to understand the nature of education and of tradition. Even the language has different words that mean multiple layers of things within the Arabic culture, cultures. And Arabic culture isn't just one thing either. Every region has its own, or every little nation in that region has its own traditions and cultures that are perhaps different. So one of the things we're doing in Qatar is developing a curriculum for the public schools, working with the teachers and working with the community to understand how the arts can be integrated, or the other subjects of a museum can be integrated into the elementary, secondary, and collegiate curriculum, not just as a separate course, but into the fabric of each one of these courses, into math, science, language, etc., so that they can be used as examples for, to help teach.
How about you?
Yeah, I think this is a situation where there has to be an exchange. I think we have to, and this is one of the little contradictions that we have to work with. We, in our case, as an institution, as the Guggenheim Foundation, have been invited to Abu Dhabi, so we need to provide whatever our value as an institution is to Abu Dhabi, and our value, it's not a specific, or a specific knowledge about the conditions in the region. At the same time, we have to be sensitive and aware that every museum, and these museums have to have a very close connection with its own environment and with its own community. So we have to be there and try to not impose, but share what we have learned from our own experience in the world, and in that sense, working with the educational institutions in the region, increasing the importance of art in the curriculum of the which at present is non-existent, for example. In the curriculum of the education in Abu Dhabi, it's part of what we are trying to do. But it's a two-way street. We have to, and the balance, it's always the most delicate problem here. How to achieve the right balance, how to develop a museum which is, as Lars says, it's connected and representative of what the place where it stands, but at the same time, how can you make that museum universally relevant?
Yes.
Because that's what they want too when they are building these museums. That's why they are asking or inviting other institutions that are not present there to be part of their mission.
I think that's a very important point you're making, because in 5 years or less, instead of having an American speak on behalf of Qatari, or a Spaniard speaking on behalf of somebody from Abu Dhabi, or a Swedish person speaking on behalf of people from Kowloon, there need to be people here who speak on their own behalf. We are technicians. We are ideocrats, I hope we are, to become able to impart the knowledge we have about process and system, but we need to listen and be the progenitors of the opportunity for the cultures themselves to speak on their own behalf.
Well, in 5 years, of course, we'll have this conversation in Lars's museum of visual culture.
I hope so. 5.5 at least.
5.5. Okay, we got it.
Let's wait 5.5. But I think it's important to underline. I mean, also to underline that we're quite different, actually. I mean, the situation in Hong Kong is quite different. I think Hong Kong has surely had a museum since more than 100 years.
Right, of course.
And there is a museum landscape, there is an art museum, there is well, actually 2 art museums, there is an alternative space scene and so forth. And of course, the audience situation is also hugely different. I mean, not only numbers, but also educational history and so forth. So, I mean, we do come from different points, but they're still specific, and they're definitely different from the US and from Europe.
Yes.
So we still have to have incredibly big ears and be very humble and move in a very sort of fluid way.
Well, I think what you all seem to be converging around is a couple of sort of truths. One is, whatever these museums will be, they'll be broader and more encompassing in some ways than our established ideas of museums. Their collections will be different. And their functions, as many of you have alluded, will be different. I mean, they are sort of really, in some of these places, one of the only sort of public institutions you can sort of go into. As one of you said, it's a kind of safe place. So like you're just starting the architectural competition, several of the Qatari projects are still ahead of us. You're actively thinking about what exactly happens in Abu Dhabi. As you look to the model of what is a successful place where people want to go, other than shiny buildings and air conditioning, what what is the allure of these places, and what are the models that you looked at? Do you look at shopping malls? Do you look at churches or mosques? Do you look at theme parks? I mean, what kind of institutional or architectural examples are you looking at that may inform the sort of language of these spaces?
If we only replicate what's been done in the past, if we only set up museums that are relatively similar to those that have been made in the 20th or the 19th century, we'll have missed a great opportunity. Because we now have, at least in Abu Dhabi and Qatar, we have, in a sense, almost a clean slate. And so it's up to us, I think, in the 21st century to look at all those models you've just mentioned. Yes, the shopping mall, the theme park, all those other ventures that have found ways to attract people for various reasons, and raise them to a higher level of discourse in which they become truly a community setting, in which dialogue among a variety of cultures can take place, in which, because we're in Qatar, the primacy of that culture really drives the conversation to a new level.
Right.
But again, I mean, we have two parties in this. We have two clients, so to say. And one is, you know, the artists and the designers and the architects and who have actually very clear ideas of what kind of space they want their works to be seen in. So and we have to listen to that, and actually we have to follow that lead. And then we have to be smart and inventive in terms of how we can make it as accessible and attractive and interesting and open for the public as possible. And of course there are lots of models around there, and there are some museum models also that are better than others in that field, and some traditions that are better than others. So you always have to sort of not just go down that sort of fantastic shopping mall or theme park or so route, but actually always remember that you're there for a reason, and that has to do with artistic production or cultural production, and we're there to sort of represent and defend and that side.
Well, that brings me to my next question. You know, you said you have two clients, the artist and the public. I would say there's probably a third in there, which is the actual patrons who are making these institutions possible. And you are, of course, each of you operating under vastly different circumstances, or in quite different circumstances. What makes a great museum patron today? I mean, you have royal families, you have real estate ventures, you have international entities that are involved here in some cases. And how do you, each of you, as you make your case to your respective patrons, how do you discourse with them to get to this right result? I mean, how do you, what makes one of these projects great? What is the role that they are playing in all of this?
That's a difficult.
Let me jump in where fools fear to tread, and say that in the case of Qatar, we're blessed by a royal family that has an infinite curiosity and a real desire to make an impact, not just in Qatar but globally, with some very high values involved. It's what brought me there in the first place, was conversations with members of the family in which I was convinced that they were truly interested in making a contribution to global conversations about more than just the arts or intellectual culture, but about peace and understanding. I mean, if you think about what the Emir and the Qatar government have been doing in their region, in Libya, in Syria, Yemen, Sudan, etc., it all comes together as a package. And I think keeping those elements all wed together as a sort of plan. The Emir of Qatar has published a 2030 plan to which all of these efforts in education, healthcare, the environment, culture have to be wed. There's a real sense of purpose about it.
Well, in our case, the Guggenheim Foundation has been has ingrained in its DNA its international dimension. I mean, the charter of the Guggenheim Foundation is from 1937, and it back then already defines the institution's aspirations as being international. The collection initially was already European for an American institution, and it has evolved since then by developing that dimension, first with physical permanent presence, like in Venice or in Bilbao, and in the future in Abu Dhabi, now even in a different dimension with our new programs, for example, with enlightened patrons like BMW or UBS, where we expand our international presence without necessarily having a physical permanent presence, but by developing relationships with artists, with curators, with educators in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So when we were invited to be part of the Abu Dhabi, the Sayyat initiative, we were intrigued, and we thought that the notion behind that effort, which was transformational, fit very well with our own capacities in terms of being an international institution, which has this utopian idea in the end that art can transform the world, that we can be a transformative institution by helping people see the world through different eyes. So that's why we are there. Mm-hmm. And with ups and downs, because these projects are always very difficult, we are still there because we believe that we have this, we are in sync with this transformational effort which lies behind this very ambitious project of developing 3 museums in Sayyat Island.
Let me ask, how many people have questions so I'll know how to anticipate? We have about 3. Okay, good. So before we get to those, I have to ask this because we're sort of treading around the question of patronage, and this is probably the question you don't want me to ask, but I will anyway, which has to do with political sensitivity, free expression, censorship, and all of that. One of the sort of touchstones of visual art culture in the West is unfettered artistic creativity, expression, no ifs and buts. You've got to let the artist speak. I think it's fair to say that those assumptions are not present in many parts of the world, including some represented here. What are the red lines that you do not cross? How do you set parameters? How do you balance local sensitivities on the one hand and the need of artists and institutions to be an open space for dialogue?
Well, in our case, we haven't still reached the moment of real presentation of the works because we're still 5 years away from the opening of the museum. Up to now, we have not encountered any, let's say, censorship. Mm-hmm. We know that this is a delicate issue, and we know that this is part of that transformational effect that lies behind this project. So we know we are in a society which is complex and which is evolving, mm-hmm. but we are a cultural institution, and we have our own standards, and we are not going to deny those standards when we move forward. We think this is going to be a learning process, but we think this is part of the transformational effect that these institutions are going to have in those places.
How do you all think about this? How do you create that sort of open zone of discourse around art?
I mean, I think it's probably a very different situation again in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is so, not everybody is aware of that, but the difference between Hong Kong and mainland China is enormous. I mean, a week ago it was the 17th anniversary, or anniversary is the wrong word, but memory of the Tiananmen Square. 180,000 people in Hong Kong goes out in the streets and creates a sort of memorial over that.
So, so you don't have to worry.
Well, I don't censorship. I mean, Uli Sig knows this part of the world very well. And of course, it was not a coincidence that he decided to give his collection, which includes, a large number of Ai Weiwei works and so on and so forth, to a Hong Kong institution. So I think censorship is not something that, well, we always have to be vigilant, of course, but censorship is not likely to happen. Mm-hmm. Then there are always cultural sensibilities and it's questions about local versus international and issues like that, which you more or less have in every country you work. And you actually do address and you do think about when you put together a program, when you make acquisitions and so forth. But that's not very different from other parts of the world. These issues are, I think the people of Hong Kong are they're really on their toes about these issues. As soon as there is any sort of threat, they're out in the streets. But it doesn't have to happen often. And censorship I haven't seen, or I don't think I will see any trace of.
Roger, your experience so far?
Well, again, it's very limited. And I am not an expert on issues of the region. But I can say that our experience there has been relatively comfortable in that regard. But here again, I think it's about the conversation and understanding the local cultural concerns and issues and working them through. Qatar is a place which my special scholarly interest in my own career has been Dutch art from the 17th and 18th century. And I think of the Netherlands, that very staunch Calvinist country with its very dour portraits of people in black dress and so on. I did an exhibition at the Museum of Islamic Art of 44 masterpieces from the Rijksmuseum from the 17th century. The point being that I think that Qatar in the 21st century is not unlike what was going on in the Netherlands in the 17th century. It's a country that has enormously long traditions in a very conservative society. And yet it is open to the cultures of the world and is trying to establish a dialogue and a presence about important ideas of change. Let's remember that Qatar was the place where Al Jazeera was founded. It's a place where the Doha debates take place for the BBC. So
and cultural institutions can be part of that kind of.
There are enormously conservative traditions held very closely by tribes and families there that need to be protected. But they're also protected in a way that allows them to have discourse. And so the challenges that come forward from the rest of the world are meted out.
Right.
I think we also have to remember in Qatar that this is a long-term project. We're building museums and a culture for the millennium here.
Yes,
so
I well remember a session in Dubai where a couple of years ago at the Global Art Forum, where there was a meeting among Western museum experts and local ones, and a lot of Westerners were very impatient. You know, how come these museums aren't ready yet, and how can you guarantee us there will be freedom? And then finally, an Emirati gentleman stood up and said, well, hold on a minute. First of all, we're investing $1 billion. Second, we just started. That's a very similar point.
Well, remember what the Metropolitan Museum would have been like in 1888. Did they have a huge attendance? Did they have all their systems in place?
Exactly.
Did they have an audience that understood everything they were about? Did they have patrons that really were cohesive in a way that projected what we now see?
As a matter of fact, I'm often struck that the attitudes that Americans had to contend with then are the very same attitudes that Americans now espouse when it comes to the emerging world. May I ask those of you who have questions, and again, I want to mention that the presenting partner of these sessions, Absolute, is recording these sessions and will be making them available online and through other means. So I think we had a couple of questions, and we do have microphones, do we not? And please tell us who you are and state your comment or question, hopefully.
My name is Mariana Halterman. I'm a dealer in London, and I currently have, together with the British Council, an exhibition of 50 sculptures of Tony Craggs traveling through China. The oldest museum is 4 years old. We have 50 sculptures, and you have touched on it, and I think maybe we're in for the long haul, or need to take the long view on how to get the audiences to become as sophisticated as they currently are in the West. But I feel in a way that we're sort of, these museum buildings sometimes they can put on, you can do great things, but you can also be a bit intimidating. So there's an interesting parallel, I think, to London, where every cab driver has a view on the art that's being shown, because he's actually been there on a Sunday with his family. How do you get the cab driver in Chengdu to not just deposit the already converted in front of the museum building, but actually go in himself?
Well, of course, none of us work in Chengdu, so we can't really help you with that. No, but I think I'm sure there are very different scenarios in each place. But actually, I mean, if I go back to European experience, because, I mean, there are these sort of views that, oh, people are not interested, and oh, contemporary art is something for an elite. And that was basically the view in London in the 1990s before Tate Modern opened. And when Tate Modern opened, suddenly Tate moved, or that museum was expected to have like 2 million people or 1.5. And suddenly you had 5.6 million people who came there. And why did it make that leap? Well, I think the key thing was that we created an institution where people didn't feel intimidated, where they felt that it's actually for them. It's not just for the others, for those others. I mean, it's a sort of creating a central feeling of ownership. I think that's a beginning. And of course, I do believe that if you can avoid charging, that's a good, because that means no one wants to pay for things they don't know what it is, but actually they're quite happy to investigate things that are for free. So I think there are some very fundamental and simple things that are partly about the ambiance and the character of the building and how you're met and taken care of as a visitor, and others are actually about super simple things like charging. And then there's an enormous amount of things that we already talked about, curriculum and educational programs and all of that. Mm-hmm. So I think some things are easy and some are really tricky. And of course, the key thing is, as we did with Tate Modern, we invited the cab drivers before anyone else to come and visit.
Next question over there.
First, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful discussion. My name is Mike Arnold. I'm a retired architect and now an artist full-time, painting and other things, but also one of the 1.7 residents of Doha, of Qatar, presently. So I've had the opportunity to watch the development of the Museum of Islamic Art go from nothing but water to the magnificent structure that it is today. My question, or perhaps it's even a comment, is the balance between the starchitects that you all work with or will be working with in the development of your facility, and having that balanced with the art that is the historical art that you're going to be presenting and the art of the future, and the impact and the influence that these buildings may or may not have on the impression that is given to, certainly within Doha, within Qatar, the capability of really an area that had very little, had a lot of cultural, but never had a cultural location that was a magnet that pulled this all together. So the question, I have 15 different questions, being the artist and the architect, but the challenges and perhaps the way that you're seeing moving forward with all of your existing new facilities, and that critical balance to make sure that previous art is represented properly and the future art is also going to be influenced, because you are going to be influencing the culture of art moving forward.
Correct. Well, since you're living in Qatar and you asked a question that seemed to be directed my way, I'm sure my colleagues have relatively better answers than I, but at least for what I see, I think in the long run, the idea is that starchitects will come from our region, and in fact, Qatar Museums Authority is working with the Aga Khan Trust on a project to help inspire architects, younger architects, and an architectural conversation in our region that will be provocative of developing a vocabulary that really has a world stage, and will help promote those buildings in the future that will come from the young talent that we're beginning to discover, perhaps even in the elementary school art programs we're putting forward now. The mixture of art and architecture is a critical one, and so we also look to neutral spaces and to put art in places in the community where it might even be unexpected, to help inspire, again, that community conversation that will help advance those ideas you've mentioned.
Last question, anyone? There's a gentleman in the back.
Hello, my name is Achim Wirtz from Zurich. I learned through the discussion that there are a lot of similarities to the field I'm working in, and that's brand management. To which extent do you manage your operations, your museums, your plans, your projects like brands? Do you have brand as a tool in mind when you make decisions?
Well, I think we have to let you talk to this.
Okay. Well, I don't particularly like the term brand. I don't think, because I think brand belongs probably to a different category. Certainly, in our case, I think we are a very specific case in the Guggenheim Foundation and the Guggenheim network of institutions. We share certainly a name, and we share certain conditions of operation for those institutions. We share collections, we share programs, mostly in anything related with content. All the institutions which are connected with that or under that umbrella, under that name, are clearly part of that. We like to see ourselves as part of a constellation rather than as parts of a planetary system where there is a sun and there are planets around. We tend to see the different institutions as stars, which are part of a constellation. Each star has its own shining moment. They sometimes are brighter or less bright, but they're all part of a system which shares values and programs and conditions of operation, which make many projects more feasible than if we would be working individually. And we basically share, as I mentioned earlier, the notion that inspired the charter of the foundation, which is that a cultural institution, it has say a political mission, a mandate to help people see the world in a different way, and in that sense make people or change the way people act in the world. And I think that's our the common value that we all share. But the term brand, I think, although we may use in the way we present ourselves some tools which may come from the, say, branding theories, we don't perceive ourselves as being part of a brand.
I mean, one of our internal mantras at M+ is of course that public trust for any cultural institution, for a museum, public trust is the key to success and to your ability to maneuver and to show difficult things and get acceptance for it. And of course, public trust is pretty similar to what actually you want to achieve when you work with branding, that there is a trust in that name, in that product, even if there's a new aspect of that project being developed. So of course, it's definitely related. We're in that field of sort of trying to establish a trust in what you're about.
Well, I think this conversation in many ways has been about this interesting question of here's one of society's most trustworthy institutions, and we want to keep it that way, but it's also an institution that needs to keep changing. And certainly for me, this conversation has brought home a couple of points. One is how much change is happening. Another one is how different your respective situations are. And I think as we learn to navigate this more global world, one of the things we do have to understand is that it's not the West and the rest. The rest is a lot of different scenarios and situations. Certainly this is an entire sector that is going through tremendous change. If I may say, if you're interested in this subject, please come to Vienna September 19th and 20th, where we'll have an international art industry forum of all different types of companies and institutions going through change. But as a closing question, I would like to ask, from each of you, just as a closing statement, as the center of gravity shifts from west and north to east and south, what is the single most surprising or most important change it will bring with it for museums? Whoever would like to start. This is the last.
The single most
important change, transformative result for museums as we shift historically towards this new part of the world. What will be, looking back 100 years from now, what will be the biggest impact?
from my perspective, I think it will be that there'll be other people at the table. There'll be other artistic expressions in the galleries. There'll be other places in which the arts occur, and there'll be more people in more languages from more cultural traditions talking to each other toward world understanding and peace.
I would say that even though they are or have become, in principle, global concepts, the concepts that we're operating with, whether we call it art or design or architecture or other things, when presented in the museum, they're not as stable as they used to be. And actually, they will probably disintegrate and they will be used as temporary tools rather than as sort of given by nature. And I think that is something that will be, very, very clear in the future museums and probably in the museums we're creating.
The last word to you, Ignacio.
I agree. I mean, I think I'm a very bad prophet, and certainly to speak 100 years from now, it's beyond my qualification. But I would think that I think the world would be a very different place. Art would be very different. These cultural institutions would be very different too. But I think what we will benefit from this, and I think it's what makes this process worthwhile, is if the process itself helps change us in the way we perceive the world and our own institutions. So it's not only that the world of art or the world of museums will be different, is that us as single specific institutions will be very, very much transformed, I think, not in 100 years, but probably in 10 years, due to this new exchange and due to this new appearance of new actors in the cultural world.
Well, on that note, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Enjoy the fair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.